Europe today was built on a catastrophe that might have taken a different shape. Fact 1. If Adolf Hitler had never come to power, the Second World War in Europe would likely not have started in the same way or on the same scale in 1939. Germany still had deep resentment after the First World War, economic pain, and political extremism, so instability would not have disappeared. But without Hitler's personal obsession with expansion, racial empire, and total war, Europe might have faced smaller regional conflicts, authoritarian governments, or delayed war instead of a continent-wide disaster that destroyed entire states. Fact 2. The Holocaust, as it happened, would almost certainly not have taken place. Anti-Semitism was already widespread in Europe, and Jewish communities still would have faced discrimination, exclusion, and violence in many countries. That is the negative truth. But Hitler's rule turned hatred into an industrial system of extermination. Without him and the Nazi state he built, millions of Jews, along with Roma, disabled people, and many others targeted by the regime, would very likely have survived. European society, culture, science, and family life would have been profoundly richer. Fact 3. The Soviet Union might have become even more influential in Europe, not less. One of the great ironies of history is that Hitler ultimately destroyed the balance of power by unleashing a war that exhausted Europe and opened the door for Soviet domination in the East. Without Hitler, there may have been no massive German invasion of the Soviet Union, but also no total collapse of Eastern Europe that allowed Moscow to control half the continent after the war. In that sense, some nations might have avoided decades of communist rule. Fact 4. At the same time, some democratic countries might have remained weaker and more hesitant for longer. The shock of Hitler forced Britain, the United States and others to mobilize on a historic scale, and later helped create a stronger post-war Western alliance. Without that extreme threat, democracies may have continued appeasement, political division, and economic caution. That could have meant a more peaceful short-term, but also a slower defense build-up, less international coordination, and more space for other dictatorships to survive or expand gradually. Fact 5. The modern world would look politically different because many of today's institutions were built from the ruins Hitler left behind. The United Nations, the shape of modern Israel, the division and later reunification of Germany, the acceleration of European integration, and even the strong post-war alliance between Western Europe and the United States were all shaped by that catastrophe. Without Hitler, millions of lives may have been saved, which is the positive side. But the negative side is that today's world order might also be less unified and less defined. Fact 6. Without Hitler, Germany might still have drifted toward authoritarian rule, but likely in a more traditional conservative form rather than a radical totalitarian regime. Military leaders or nationalist politicians could have taken control, limiting democracy and civil rights, but without the same ideological extremism. This means repression would still exist, opposition would still be silenced, and minorities would still face discrimination. However, the absence of a fanatical, all-consuming ideology could have prevented the complete militarization of society and the catastrophic decisions that followed. Fact 7. The global economy might have stabilized differently and possibly more slowly. Hitler's rise led to massive state spending on rearmament and infrastructure, which reduced unemployment in Germany but ultimately prepared the country for war. Without him, Germany may have continued struggling through economic recovery during the Great Depression. This could have caused prolonged hardship for millions of Germans, increasing political unrest across Europe. On the positive side, economic recovery might have been more sustainable and less tied to militarization and destruction. Fact 8. The United States might not have become a global superpower as quickly as it did. The Second World War pulled the US out of economic depression and positioned it as a dominant force in global politics. Without a large-scale European war, America may have remained more isolationist for longer. This could mean a slower expansion of its military and political influence worldwide. At the same time, fewer lives would have been lost, and global conflicts might have remained more regional rather than escalating into a world war. Fact 9. Technological progress would have followed a different path. Many major innovations, such as advances in rocketry, aviation, medicine, and nuclear technology, were accelerated by the pressures of war. Without Hitler and the war he initiated, these technologies might have developed more slowly and under less destructive circumstances. This is both positive and negative. Fewer weapons of mass destruction would exist early on, but certain medical and engineering breakthroughs that saved lives later might have been delayed by years or even decades. Fact 10. The map of Europe would likely look very different today. Without the war, there would have been no division of Germany into East and West, no Iron Curtain in the same form, and no forced redrawing of borders across Central and Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and others might have evolved more independently without massive displacement of populations. However, underlying ethnic tensions and territorial disputes would still exist, meaning Europe might have faced ongoing smaller conflicts instead of one devastating, defining war. Fact 11. Without Hitler, the idea of a united Europe might have emerged much later, or in a completely different form. The devastation of the Second World War pushed European nations to cooperate economically and politically to prevent future conflicts. Without that shared trauma, countries like France and Germany might have remained cautious rivals for decades. While this could have avoided destruction, it may also have delayed integration projects that later brought stability and prosperity, such as early economic unions and cross-border cooperation. Fact 12. The State of Israel might not have been created in 1948 in the same way or at that time. The Holocaust played a major role in accelerating international support for a Jewish homeland. Without that tragedy, Jewish migration to Palestine would still have occurred, but global urgency and sympathy would have been much lower. This could have delayed the formation of Israel or changed its borders and political structure, potentially altering the entire history of the Middle East, for better in some ways, but also possibly creating different long-term tensions. Fact 13. Millions of soldiers and civilians across Europe and Asia would have survived, but their lives would not necessarily have been peaceful or prosperous. Without a large-scale war, many authoritarian regimes might have remained in place longer, suppressing freedoms and maintaining rigid social hierarchies. The absence of total war would save lives, which is undeniably positive. However, the lack of a dramatic reset could mean slower social change, fewer revolutions in rights, and prolonged inequality in many societies. Fact 14. Germany's reputation in the modern world would be entirely different. Instead of being associated with the horrors of Nazism and the need for post-war reconstruction, Germany might have continued as a powerful but controversial European state, shaped by its First World War defeat. Without Hitler, there would be no need for denazification, no deep national reckoning with genocide, and no division of the country. This could mean a more stable national identity, but also less awareness of the dangers of extremist ideology. Fact 15. Propaganda, mass media control and political manipulation might have evolved more slowly. The Nazi regime demonstrated how modern technology, radio, film and mass rallies, could be used to control public opinion on a massive scale. Without that example, other governments might not have adopted such techniques as quickly or aggressively. On the positive side, societies might have remained more open in the short term. On the negative side, the world might have been less prepared to recognize and resist large-scale manipulation when it eventually appeared in different forms. Fact 16. Without Hitler, the concept of human rights might have developed more slowly on a global scale. The horrors of the Second World War directly led to the creation of documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Without such extreme examples of cruelty, the urgency to define and protect basic human dignity might not have been as strong. While fewer atrocities would have occurred, the legal and moral frameworks that protect people today could have taken decades longer to emerge and gain international support. Fact 17. The field of medicine would have evolved differently, both positively and negatively. On one hand, millions of lives would not have been lost, and unethical human experimentation would not have occurred under Nazi rule. On the other hand, wartime conditions accelerated medical innovation, including trauma care, surgery techniques, and antibiotics. Without that pressure, some life-saving treatments might have taken longer to develop, so while humanity avoids horrific crimes, it may also lose some of the urgency that pushed medical progress forward. Fact 18. The Cold War might never have taken the same shape, or might not have happened at all in its familiar form. The division of Europe into Western and Soviet spheres was a direct result of the Second World War's outcome. Without Hitler triggering that massive conflict, The United States and the Soviet Union may not have emerged as rival superpowers so quickly. However, ideological tensions between capitalism and communism would still exist, meaning a different kind of global rivalry could have developed, possibly slower, but still dangerous. Fact 19. Colonial empires might have lasted longer. The Second World War weakened European powers like Britain and France, accelerating the process of decolonization across Asia and Africa. Without that war, these empires might have maintained control over their territories for many more years. This means fewer immediate conflicts caused by rapid independence, which is a positive. But it also means prolonged foreign rule, delayed self-determination, and extended exploitation of colonized populations, which is a significant negative. Fact 20. Cultural and scientific migration patterns would have changed dramatically. Many intellectuals, scientists, and artists fled Nazi-controlled Europe, especially Jewish refugees who contributed significantly to countries like the United States. Without Hitler, this forced migration would not have occurred at the same scale. Europe might have retained more of its intellectual capital, strengthening its academic and cultural institutions. At the same time, countries that benefited from this influx of talent might have developed more slowly in science, technology, and the arts. Fact 21. Without Hitler, the military strategies and doctrines that shaped modern warfare would have evolved differently. Blitzkrieg tactics, large-scale armoured warfare, and coordinated air-ground operations were refined and demonstrated during the early years of the war. Without this conflict, military innovation would still continue, but likely at a slower and more theoretical pace. This could mean fewer devastating wars in the short term, but also less preparation for future conflicts, potentially making later wars more chaotic and unpredictable. Fact 22. The psychological understanding of trauma and post-war recovery might have developed much later. The massive number of soldiers and civilians affected by the war forced societies to confront issues like post-traumatic stress, grief, and long-term mental health care. Without such a large-scale conflict, these issues would still exist, but might remain less visible and less studied. This could delay the development of psychological support systems, leaving many people without proper understanding or treatment for decades. Fact 23. Japan's role in global history might have unfolded differently. Although Japan's expansion in Asia began before Hitler's rise, the global nature of the war tied its fate closely to events in Europe. Without a major European war, international responses to Japan's actions in Asia might have been more focused and possibly more limited. This could either prevent escalation into a wider conflict or, conversely, allow Japan to expand further without facing a unified global opposition. Fact 24. The development and use of nuclear weapons might have been delayed or taken a different path. The urgency of the Second World War drove rapid progress in nuclear research, leading to the creation and use of atomic bombs. Without that pressure, scientific exploration of nuclear energy would still continue, but likely under more controlled and less militarized conditions. This means the world might avoid early nuclear devastation, but it also means nuclear weapons could emerge later, potentially in a different geopolitical context. Fact 25. Global alliances would likely be less clearly defined. The Second World War forced countries to choose sides, creating strong political and military alliances that shaped the second half of the 20th century. Without Hitler's war, these alliances might have remained weaker, more flexible, or constantly shifting. This could reduce the risk of large-scale global conflict in the short term, but it might also create a more unstable international system, where trust is limited and cooperation is harder to maintain. Fact 26. Without Hitler, the legal concept of crimes against humanity might not have been clearly defined when it was. The Nuremberg trials established a global precedent for holding leaders accountable for atrocities committed against civilians. Without the scale of Nazi crimes, international law may not have evolved so quickly in this direction. This could mean fewer immediate legal protections for vulnerable populations. At the same time, it might have taken other conflicts or tragedies later in history to force the world to confront and define such principles. Fact 27. Education systems around the world would likely teach a very different version of modern history. The Second World War is a central reference point for understanding politics, ethics, and international relations today. Without Hitler, that defining moment would be missing or replaced by a series of smaller conflicts. This could make history feel less dramatic, but also less instructive. The clear lessons about extremism, propaganda, and genocide might be less visible, potentially making societies slower to recognize similar dangers in the future. Fact 28. The role of women in the workforce might have expanded more slowly. During the war, millions of women entered industries and jobs traditionally held by men, accelerating social change in many countries. Without this massive shift, progress toward gender equality and employment could have taken longer. This means fewer immediate opportunities and slower social transformation. However, the change might have come more gradually and with less disruption, potentially reducing backlash but also delaying important advances in rights and representation. Fact 29. Urban development across Europe would look entirely different. Many cities were heavily bombed and later rebuilt with modern infrastructure, architecture, and planning. Without the destruction caused by war, historic city centres would have remained more intact, preserving cultural heritage. This is a clear positive. However, modernisation might have been slower, and some cities could have continued struggling with outdated infrastructure, overcrowding, and industrial pollution for a longer time. Fact 30. The moral identity of the modern world would be less sharply defined. The extreme contrast between the atrocities of the Nazi regime and the response of the international community helped shape global values around justice, tolerance, and human dignity. Without such a clear example of evil, these values might still exist, but they would be less universally emphasized. This could lead to a more ambiguous moral landscape, where lines between acceptable and unacceptable behavior are less clearly drawn. Fact 31. Without Hitler, the 20th century would likely be remembered as a period of tension and gradual change rather than catastrophic transformation. Millions of lives would have been saved, cultures preserved, and cities left standing. But the absence of such a defining crisis might also mean slower progress in international cooperation, human rights, and global awareness. The world could be more stable in some ways, yet less united and less prepared for future challenges. History without catastrophe might be safer, but also less awake to danger. What do you think?